Student Academic Services for the Faculty of Arts and Science at Concordia University. I am also a professor at the Department of Études Françaises. I'm delighted to welcome you all here tonight, and merci beaucoup à tout le monde pour votre présence. The WSSR is an innovative and cutting-edge learning initiative designed to give participants privileged access to high-profile individuals, an opportunity to develop new insights, and a competitive advantage to advance their decision-making and problem-solving capacities and help them to build important networks. To the extent that viability matters, this program so far has been immensely successful, as evidenced in part by the fact that the WSSR has been in existence since 2008, so almost 12 years. Only a workshop with so many advantages can offer an advantage to people. And nowadays, it has over 50 to 60 workshops and events such as this one per year. Moreover, the credit component of the program now offers more than 10 different full credit courses to choose from. Over the last year, the main theme of the WSSR has been to project forward to the election, the federal election that we just had this past Monday, and to deliberate on a variety of different topics that were likely to be relevant to the people who are going to vote, of course, everybody, including us. The response has been nothing short of amazing. In total, over the last year, more than 450 students and participants of various types have attended over 90 different workshops and public events and engaged in meaningful ways with our extensive roster of speakers, including former premiers, party leaders, senators, top public level servants, outspoken pundits, media, and learners in cutting-edge and influential research. So much has been discussed and learned along the way, and it is only fitting that we bring this very rewarding series to a close by carefully unpacking what was in many ways a very intriguing federal election campaign and end result of election 2019. Tonight, we are extremely fortunate to have 6 very capable panelists and 1 very astute and eager moderator, all of whom, I might add, are regular WSSR lecturers and contributors. They are all here and ready to help us to make better sense of the results of the 2019 federal election. So on behalf of Concordia University, the Faculty of Arts and Science, and the WSSR, I would like to welcome all our panelists here tonight and say that I, for one, am looking forward to hearing all of your insights on the extremely important democratic exercise that we all just underwent. So without further delay, because I know that we have a very full, tight schedule and agenda here tonight, let's get started. Let me give the floor to our moderator for tonight, an award-winning journalist and now also a professor at Concordia University, Aphrodite Salas.
Merci. Merci. Thank you, Dr. Kenyon. Our objective for tonight's discussion will be to bring together what we think are some of the best experts and practitioners in the field to provide us with their insights on particularly key aspects of the 2019 federal election, which, when taken together, will hopefully help us to better understand what happened. To start things off tonight, we have Dr. Harold Clark, who is a professor at the University of Texas at Dallas. Dr. Clark is a veteran of the study of Canadian elections, not to mention that both he and another one of our panelists tonight have also recently co-published with others the 4th edition of one of the most influential books on the subject of Canadian elections and voting behavior. Dr. Clark is here tonight to share his sharp analytical perspective on the overall outcome of the federal election 2019, what happened and why. Next to Dr. Clark, we have Rachel Curran, former Director of Policy to Prime Minister Stephen Harper. Ms. Curran has been directly involved at the highest levels in several election campaigns and has been at the forefront of designing many party platforms and throne speeches. Ms. Curran is here tonight to provide us with her critical insights on the core substance of the federal election campaign and whether, from her perspective, there was any serious discussion of issues, ideas, or carefully thought out plans, and whether the issue, she's like, I mean, I kind of knew what you were going to do anyway. And whether the issue discussions that we had or tried to have were relevant, meaningful, and helpful for voters. Beside Ms. Curran, we have Dr. Larry Leduc, now Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Toronto. Professor Leduc also has a very long track record of studying elections in Canada as well as in a variety of other democratic states. And in addition, Dr. Leduc has conducted very notable research on a host of related topics such as referendums, voter turnout, and electoral leaders' debates. Federal election 2019 featured 3 main debates, 2 in French and 1 in English, and our hope tonight is that Professor Leduc can help us to make some sense of what happened during these debates. I know it might not be easy, but that's why we brought you in. Whether they produced any clear winners and whether they were at all relevant to us as voters. Next, we have Mr. Kevin Page, who many of you, I am sure, will recognize as Canada's first parliamentary budget officer. Mr. Page has spent many years analyzing and making sense of government budgets, expenditures, and revenues in Canada and in many other countries around the world. In fact, during the most recent election, Mr. Page and his team provided costing confirmations for several of the parties that we as voters in turn considered voting for. So it is not surprising, therefore, that we have asked him to join us here tonight to provide us with his post-election reflections on the platform costing that was provided to us by the various political parties during this past election, and whether his experience suggests that these costing projections were accurate, transparent, accessible, and in his mind appropriate given the current fiscal context and Canada's current fiscal situation and needs. Next to Mr. Page, we have another well-recognized personality, Ms. Carol McNeil from the CBC. Ms. McNeil, as many of you know, has accumulated a wealth of direct experience covering both Canadian politics and elections over the years, and during this past election, she had a daily show that was dedicated specifically to providing Canadians with some of the media coverage that they quite likely benefited from when making their informed choices. Ms. McNeil is here tonight to provide us with her perspectives on whether the media coverage during the past federal election was fair, relevant, and helpful to voters. And these are by no means easy questions to resolve, but our hope is that Ms. McNeil will help add to our thinking on these issues with her experienced insights. Wonderful. And last but certainly not least, we have Canada's former Chief Electoral Officer, Jean-Pierre Kingsley, who served for no less than 18 years and led Elections Canada through many transformations that at the time were unprecedented. Electoral systems and rules are something that formed part of the relevant discourse prior to this last election, as I'm sure you'll all recall. The former Liberal government's failed attempt at electoral reform, the implementation of Bill C-76, and all the fairly dramatic talk about the potential for foreign intervention. Mr. Kingsley is here tonight to speak to some of these matters and to provide us with his experienced insights on the fairness of this election campaign and to access the effectiveness of some of the steps that we took prior to the election. So welcome everybody, and thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And just so that I can give you an idea of how things will work tonight, each panelist will have 7 minutes at the start to provide us with their reflections on some questions that we have prepared to ask them to comment on as part of the panel. So after that, we will open it up to your questions, some of which we have already collected from many of you prior to the beginning of tonight's event, and I have them up with me here. Our event tonight is scheduled to end by 7:45, and part of my job is to make sure that that happens. So no matter how interesting and vigorous our discussion may be, that is what our aim is tonight, to have a wonderful discussion and make sure that we don't go on for too long. So let us begin. The opening question is to Dr. Clark. Professor Clark, could you please start us off? The question is, why did federal election 2019 turn out the way it did?
Well, thank you. As a typical academic, I've got 7 minutes and 70 slides. So there's one of them right now. So obviously I will be, quite discriminating in terms of, at least, to keep with the spirit of the 7 minutes, to go reasonably quickly here and to focus just on a few of these in an attempt to answer your question. To start with, though, let me just pick up a couple of things. This will be familiar to a lot of us who followed the election closely, and this is the trends in vote intention in over 460 polls that were conducted over the last 4 years. And to me, the really interesting thing is that it's quite evident from the numbers that it was going to be really hard for anybody to get a majority. I mean, the result the other night should not have been a surprise to us. I think that's sort of the takeaway message I have for fellow panelists and for the audience, is that this is something that should not have surprised. And those numbers right there give us the insight. We can skip over that one. That will make pollsters feel good. Their average miss was only 1.6% at the end, although the misses they did have, we might argue, in some ways where it may have been quite consequential. We'll need more data and more time. I always, as a political science professor, I'm always saying more data, more data. Give me money and I'll get more data. And of course, here's the result. We all know now what that was. And again, no surprise, but I guess if there was anything there that might have surprised some people in terms of the framework of a minority result, is just how strong the Liberal vote total, or seat total, really was. That surprised me a little bit. I actually thought the NDP was going to actually create a situation in Ontario where both the NDP and the Conservatives would get more seats and drive that Liberal total down. Didn't happen, though. What I want to talk about, though, with the time that I do have, in terms of just like what drove the vote at the individual level. And of course, it's the beginning of wisdom for people who study elections, is to separate what's driving the vote for individuals from what's actually creating the election outcome, in terms of how those votes are distributed across all of these different constituencies in a first-past-the-post system can produce all sorts of results that may not, that's another question, and it's not really fully anticipated by understanding what are the principal drivers of voting choice at the individual level. Over the past, I can say now, a long time, I won't say several, I did say several decades, Larry and I and two other colleagues who are not here, Jane Jensen at the University of Montreal and John Pamet at Carleton, some of you may well know these people, have been studying voting behavior here in Canada, and the results of our work fit very well, I would argue, with what we found already, without having all of the data that we want, for understanding why the Conservatives did not do as well as a number of people thought they might, and the Liberals actually did performed very, very strongly in the context of a minority. Three major drivers of electoral choice that we found over time. A key one is party performance on what we call valence issues. These are issues like the economy, which is a canonical example, but also health care, education, security, and of course now the environment as well. These are issues where virtually everyone agrees on the goal. I mean, it's hard to find people who, you know, I suppose on Wall Street, people short and Bay Street shorting the shorting the loonie or something like this. You can find some of these people, but the vast majority of people want a healthy economy characterized by vigorous, sustainable growth, low rates of inflation and unemployment, and so forth. Similarly with healthcare, it's hard to find people who want bad healthcare. It's hard to find people who want dirty air and water. And so, you know, these kinds of issues dominate in terms of importance for the voters. Other issues get a lot of media play sometimes, things like same-sex marriage in the United States, for example, questions of abortion and so forth. Some of these social issues get a lot, these hot-button social issues get a lot of attention in the media, but when it comes to voting, we have found repeatedly that the valence issues that I mentioned really drive the decisions voters make. When they do this, their interpretation of how to go with these valence issues are guided by two key heuristics, or cues, if you will. One of these is partisanship, and as a lot of us know in Canada, and indeed more so in some other countries than we previously recognized, partisan attachments tend to be quite fluid. And there are substantial minorities of people who are willing to, in any electoral context, who are willing to leave their party, quote unquote, and move along. And this, of course, creates a situation where there's always a possibility of large-scale change. Not always realized, but that's an ongoing possibility. Then finally, leader images. This is really a very important heuristic, and one that I argue even right now we can see was very important this time around. Let me skip over the economy. Surprisingly, perhaps, given what the things people said about the competence of Justin Trudeau coming into the 2015 election, the economy in Canada has actually been quite good. Not perfect, and housing costs, of course, you know, housing prices very high and going up, but other things looking very good. And that's a big plus. Prosperity is a huge plus. Then, whoops, what's going on here? Federal partisanship, we don't have the individual level data yet. I'll go right to the leaders, and here's a big payoff, folks. A big payoff. Impressions of party leaders. Just take a look at those numbers. Trudeau, positively viewed and on balance, but look at Scheer. Look at that. Really poorly received. And a lot of I will argue right now that this is really important for understanding this outcome. He simply did not make the impression he needed to make for whatever reason. Maybe we'll learn something tonight about that, and we certainly will going forward. And then finally, preferred prime minister. Trudeau at 37, not really high, but Scheer only at 31. And you're not going to win an election, much less a majority, with those kinds of numbers. And I think I must be at my 7 minutes maybe now.
7:06, you are a king.
Am I there?
I love it. You're
okay, so let me stop there. This is a classic valence politics election, and you don't need to know much more than know about the Canadian economy and know about how the leaders were received to have a pretty good insight about how things would go. So let me stop there.
Thank you. Thank you, Dirk McCoy. We're going to revisit you as each person. Ms. Curran, you're up next. Did federal election 2019 contain any substantive, deep discussion of issues that was truly relevant? I mean, was the discussion actually helpful for voters? I know, but I mean, is that even what people want? But anyway.
Yeah, she might agree with me here. So I'm going to say in short, no. I'm going to try and keep this shorter than 7 minutes because I think getting to questions is important. But look, for some inexplicable reason, inexplicable in particular for the Conservative Party, who aren't in the business of spending a lot of money, the parties decided that the battleground should be affordability. What that meant is that they competed with each other to throw baubles and goodies at voters in the form of benefit increases and tax credits, for example, to the point where many voters simply tuned out, like it just became noise. Now, it's true that voters are concerned about the cost of living, and I'm personally in favor of keeping taxes as low as possible, but none of the baubles on offer actually addressed the underlying causes of why housing prices are so high in urban centers, for example, or why daycare fees are through the roof. It's not so much a problem in Quebec, it's a real problem in places like Toronto. Or why cell phone charges are extortionate, and you saw all three parties talking about that. So the proposals they were offering, the measures they were offering, were really cynical and shallow vote-buying efforts at best. What the parties studiously ignored was the much bigger issues that we need to grapple with and resolve as a country, in my view. One of the big ones. And this is now creating deep regional divisions in the country that I'm pretty worried about. How do we reconcile resource development with environmental protection? The inability and unwillingness of parties to address that has really led, I think, to a problematic outcome. It's going to continue to be problematic. To make it simple, we need to determine whether we are in the resource development business or not, particularly the oil and gas development and export business. If we are in that business, how do we also address climate change in a credible way? If we're not in the business, how do we fill the revenue hole? It's 11% of our GDP, which amounts to billions of dollars, and replace the hundreds of thousands of high-paying jobs linked to the energy sector, particularly in Western Canada. And of course, that's a big point of contention there now. So another big issue, the rapidly changing and unstable geopolitical context. Our international relationships are in a precarious state at best. I'm not going to blame that on Mr. Trudeau right now, but I might later. We're in a serious and potentially very damaging standoff with China. The US no longer has our back, thanks to President Trump. So how do we ensure Canada's stability in this new world? Where and how do we continue to have a real voice? The Europeans are grappling with this too and have reached out to us, but we've got our heads in the sand, at least during the course of this election campaign. The global economic landscape is changing equally quickly. The best indicators appear to show that a recession is looming. How severe it will be is hard to say, but it's coming. We're in an environment of very low economic growth. The last federal budget projected sub 2% for the foreseeable future for the first time ever, and a rapidly aging population. Foreign investment in Canada is down. We've been shielded so far by the recent US economic boom, and that's not going to last forever. So how do we secure Canada's competitiveness and its future prosperity? How do we ensure that our social programs are sustainable and that we'll be able to pay for them in future when we're racking up deficits and debt during good economic times? A lot of provincial balance sheets, the federal balance sheet is okay for now, thanks to the efforts of Paul Martin and Jean Chrétien and Stephen Harper, but a lot of provincial balance sheets are in terrible shape, and hopefully Mr. Page will talk about that as well. Indigenous reconciliation, what do we do about the large numbers of First Nations people living in appalling poverty? How can and should they be integrated into Canada's economy? What do the jobs and workforce of the future look like? Are we giving kids, are we giving adult workers the skills they need to succeed in what is now a global labor market? What should our immigration system look like? Should we be seizing the opportunity to bring the cream of the crop internationally to Canada now? Or should we be ensuring that every Canadian has a job first? So you see my point. None of this was addressed in the recent election campaign at all. We got the briefest and shallowest of talking points at best on some of these issues. So we really didn't get into the issues that we as Canadians, as a country, should be talking about. You've also asked, Aphrodite, whether it was helpful. Well, look, this was a short campaign. It was 40 days. I actually think it should be longer. But it was helpful in that it gave voters who were paying attention a good sense of who the leaders were and what their messages were. So we saw that in the movement of numbers over the course of the campaign, which Harold has also alluded to. Andrew Scheer became less popular, so did Justin Trudeau. Jagmeet Singh became more popular because of his performance during the campaign. So campaigns do matter. They are helpful in assisting voters to make a choice. I just think it's too bad that no one took the opportunity during the campaign to talk about the really important things. Thanks.
Thank you. Next, Professor Leduc, what did you make of the leaders' debates that were held during election 2019? Were there any clear winners, and did voters benefit from them?
Thank you, Aphrodite. That's a good intro into the topic. I'm going to talk about debates, or try to talk about them without using any sports metaphors. And if I did use any, they wouldn't be from the boxing ring. So no knockout punches. And I'm probably not even going to really talk about winners and losers, although I'll come to that sort of by way of conclusion. But I wanted to start by saying a few things about debates, because first of all, they've been around for a long time. I mean, debates now in Canada and in many other countries as well are just a part of election campaigns. So, and they're a part of election campaigns that we actually know quite a bit about, not just by studying past examples, but by studying debates in other places and in other times. And part of the problem in the way we often talk about them in a context of a single election is that our framing of what's really going on in a debate is about 40 years or so out of date. We're still thinking of the Kennedy-Nixon debates of the 1960s or the Mulroney-Turner debates of the 1980s, but debates have moved on. And they evolve and change with each election, and each time we have another case to think about or examine, we learn something about them, and what we learn is often different than what we thought we knew before. So there's a learning curve, but it's not just a learning curve for academics or other people who look at them from a distance. It's also a learning curve for parties, for the leaders, for political strategists, for pollsters. So what you see in these debates in this campaign, or see in any particular election campaign, is a picture of debates that is based on what the people involved and who are structuring them or participating in them have learned from previous debates. And that was very much on show in the debates in this election. We as academics also know a lot about debates from studying them. And one of the things that we have learned about them over the years is that they matter a lot less in electoral outcomes than people think they do. Not saying they're unimportant, it's just that they don't matter very much. Well, why is that? Well, it's partly because the leaders and the parties follow strategies in those debates that are designed to make them less impactful in an election, or that are largely defensive strategies to prevent them from having the kind of shocking events like you got in the 1980s with "you had an option, sir," you know, or in the 1988 debate, "you've sold us out," you know. We don't have moments like that in debates anymore because they're not structured the way they were back then. So what happens? The debate is still important, but they occur in the middle, pretty much at the center point of the campaign. That's for good reason, because it lowers the risks. In other words, if someone does make a misstep in the debates or blunders on a particular point or a particular issue or question, they still have several weeks to recover from it. And in previous elections, when there has been an incident like that, often the polls pick it up right away. It has an effect for 2 or 3 days, and then the effect starts to ebb. So by the time you get to election day, that whatever impact there was is gone. Let me just mention in sort of short point form a few of the things that we academics think we know about debates, besides that effect over the campaign. We know that prime ministers can never win. There's no benefit in a debate for the incumbent prime minister. So the prime minister now goes in with defensive strategies simply designed to get through it and without any damage. And that's the way they begin, and that's the way they usually turn out. So the idea that you're going to trap a prime minister with some clever statement in the course of a debate is much less likely today than it was 20 or 30 years ago. But prime ministers can dictate the terms of the debate, or some of the terms at least, because if they don't agree to participate, there won't be a debate. And so usually they will be very coy or hesitant about participation, then there'll be some negotiations, then eventually they agree to as few debates or as minimal a package as they can get by with. And then they follow defensive strategies. The opposition doesn't have much choice because they have to accept the terms of the governing party, usually in the end. Every once in a while you get a debate with the empty chair, but that's not very satisfying because no one pays much attention to it. Opposition leaders really need the debates. Mr. Scheer needed this debate because it makes him appear as a potential prime minister, and that would have been his goal going in, is to look the equal of Mr. Trudeau, to say, well, this is someone that I think could be prime minister. The format of the debates in this election didn't really help that agenda very much, which is part of the reason why he came out with a very forceful attack on Mr. Trudeau right at the very beginning, because he knew he wouldn't get too many chances to showcase his positions as they evolved. The minor parties win in debates just by participating in them, and the smaller the party, the bigger the payoff for participation. And these particular debates, with 6 leaders on the stage, and each of them getting equal speaking time, that is a tremendous benefit particularly for the NDP, but also for the other 2 smaller parties. And Mr. Singh took full advantage of that, and that's why many people afterwards felt that he gained the most from the debates. I'd stop short of using the term winner, but he certainly gained, but he was bound to gain just from the way they were structured, and his good performance simply added to that. I think we should, in evaluating the debates in the election campaign, avoid singling them out and separating them from all the other things that we talk about in the context of elections, including some of the things that Harold mentioned earlier. Because if Mr. Singh benefited from the debates, he benefited from them being one of several elements of a strong campaign performance. Mr. Trudeau in 2015 derived the same benefits. There were 5 sets of debates in 2015, many more than this time. Each time Mr. Trudeau performed well, and it was a longer campaign, to pick up on Rachel's point. And in that long campaign, if you consistently outperform expectations, you're going to benefit. Mr. Singh in this campaign, exceeded expectations from the beginning. Every time he had a chance to speak to a larger public, he came out of it pretty well, and the debates were perhaps one of the most important of those moments, but not certainly the only ones. I think that brings us to the question I wanted to conclude with, and there may be some further discussion of this later, the format of the 2019 debates, particularly the English debate, with 6 leaders and 5 moderators, and little choppy segments continually at a maximum of 45 seconds. I think that's probably a format that we won't see again, but again, that will be interesting to think about how debates may evolve yet further in the next time around.
Thank you, Dr. Leduc. Thank you. Absolutely, the format, especially of that particular debate, was really something that a lot of people, after the fact, questioned. Just to pick up on a couple of threads of our 3 speakers and then move to the other side, it's interesting because you said that the NDP leader, Jagmeet Singh, did very well in one of the debates, and then also Dr. Clark, had acknowledged that, he had done quite well, but that still didn't translate into the breakthrough that many people were expecting. So what was that about? And also, when talking about the debates, the format almost seems impossible to incorporate the kinds of things that Ms. Curran was discussing, and the deeper issues, the ones that really do require a wider conversation. So it seems that we're stuck, and how do we fix it? But we'll get to that in the question-answer period. I'll turn to Mr. Page now. Mr. Page, what would you say about the platform costing during this election campaign? Was it transparent? Was it accessible? And was it informative for voters?
Okay, I would maybe just a little bit of context on platform costing, and I would look at it 2 ways. One is kind of like the fiscal plan or the fiscal policy of the country, which is like, do we have like, are we being fiscally responsible? And then the costing really is just the arithmetic when we kind of go through all the various measures. And again, the individual platforms, there could be 50, 60, 70 measures that, you know, that had to be costed, or there were numbers on a spreadsheet. But in terms of context, like I don't think like the fiscal responsibility wasn't, or fiscal policy wasn't a big part of the debate in this election campaign. Like if you go back in time, it was a big part of discussion in the early 1990s, mid-1990s in Canada, where after a period of, you know, a decade and a half, we ran these large deficits, and our debt relative to the income of the economy just sort of got to very high levels. You know, we were facing pressures in bond markets for downgrades, and we had to make an adjustment. So it was a big debate, you know, in those like early mid-1990s elections. I would say it was also a debate, ironically, in 2015, where, you know, after Prime Minister Harper made a commitment to get back to balance, we ran relatively large deficits in the recession. He wanted to get back to balance, and people could kind of feel, with oil prices being a bit low and kind of penny pinching a little bit, that it was having a drag on the economy. And so Prime Minister Trudeau, or at that time leader of the third party, came in and said, I'm going to run some modest deficits. And in that environment, actually, that was interesting, because like it's just a very different environment than the 70s and 80s. We've never really lived, you know, interest rates at these low levels, where like Treasury bill rates less than 1%, 10-year government bond rates at 1%. So we've been adding to the stock of debt since 2007 and 8, and yet the carrying cost of this debt, you know, the kind of like our credit the credit card part of the debt, where the interest that we pay relative to revenues, it continues to decline, even though we're adding to the stock of debt. It's because we haven't really seen this type of environment before, with these incredibly low interest rates. So like going into this, like, you know, was fiscal responsibility going to be part of the debate? I think all the leaders looked at Prime Minister Trudeau and said, geez, you won with this kind of looser fiscal policy in 2015. Even though Mr. Scheer said, I want to get back to balance, in 5 years, literally, that he really wasn't in any hurry to get back to balance, because you could balance the books if it was a priority. We weren't that far away from balance in 2018 and 19. The deficit federally was $14 billion. That's like about, you know, a little over half a percentage point of GDP. That's a very low deficit for Canada historically and internationally. But I would just say about the platform costing part, you know, it was actually, you know, and Rachel's made all the right points. Like, I wish Rachel would write all the platforms in the next election. All the platforms, not just one party, but all the platforms, because we need to deal with all those issues. But yeah, actually, just from a fiscal perspective, like, actually all the parties did a pretty good job. Like, they all had fiscal plans. Like, we all had tables with numbers and revenues and spending and, you know, and deficit and debt numbers, and they had measures that were costed for the very first time by this independent parliamentary budget office. And the whole, that economic outlook, where's the economy going in the next few years, that was, all those numbers came from an independent source. So they all started from this sort of same, you know, level playing field, which was actually quite incredible. So I have to say, like, it was really well done from that point. You could be really bored about, we did not talk about all the important issues that Rachel wanted us to talk about, but from the point of view of this, like, those numbers, like, couldn't we have trust in those numbers? We actually, for the most part, I think we could have trust in those numbers. I would say the role of the Parliamentary Budget Office was actually quite transformative. Even when you look globally, like, who else does this? Nobody quite did it the way the Parliamentary Budget Office in Canada did it, so kudos to that office. They provided that independent outlook. They provided costings for all the various parties. You know, on all those debates that Larry talked about, it was mentioned, like, we use the PBO to cost this and that. And, you know, obviously there was, because, you know, Rachel talked about some of the affordability measures, like changing a rate or a bracket, or, you know, changing the basic personal amount, or changing a tax credit, not too complicated for people like at the Parliamentary Budget Office, to cost like pharmacare or dental care. That's a bit harder to do, and we definitely had some of those proposals. But it was, I would say, transformative, the way Canada used the Parliamentary Budget Office. And I think the rest of the world's going to be looking at Canada in that sense. I think in terms of like the transparency side of it, yes, there was a high level of transparency in these numbers. And I think there were some best practices established. I think the Conservatives and the Liberals, you can go to their platforms and say maybe you have a disabled child, or maybe you're a senior and you're wondering, what's this 10% increase somebody might want to give me to this credit? You could go to to one of those party platforms. You could get a press release, you can get a backgrounder, and you can get a two-pager from the Parliamentary Budget Office. We've never had that before. We don't want to go backwards. This is really moving forward in a positive way. I would say, and maybe on a little bit, there were definitely blind sides. On the policy sides, and Rachel talked about some of these sorts of issues, there were debates that we didn't have where parties would say, I'm going to get to zero net emissions in 2050. Where's the plan? There's nothing behind it. We're going to do great things for First Nation people. Where are the plan? There's no numbers. Or I think sadly, in the case of the Conservatives, after doing very well in the first few weeks of the campaign, they said, on the day of advanced voting, on the day after all the debates, they said, well, I'm going to get back to balance, and here's $15 billion of annual cuts that you're going to have to kind of stomach, and with not a lot of details. I would say, on the question of the accessibility, yes, I would say accessibility. Now, is it informative? Did we really use the opportunity the way Rachel wanted us to use the opportunity to have these sorts of debates? This issue on fiscal policy for people like me, the governments are relatively large sides of our economy, so you actually do want to know, these fiscal plans, are we sustainable? Is it okay to run these deficits of 1% of GDP? Are we okay with debt around 30%? I think even going forward, I think there's a risk now that things can get a little bit looser. In a minority parliament, I think there's a risk that the Liberals can even loosen up their fiscal anchors. They want to keep this debt to GDP ratio on a downward track. I think they're looking for money in this environment, and they're right now. I think we've all kind of come numb to $20 billion deficits. We might become numb to $30 billion deficits over the medium term. So we missed some of those debates, and I think Rachel's absolutely right. 2 seconds.
Amazing. Clearly, you do balance things well, because that was brilliant. 2 seconds.
The content was terrible, but it did balance it well.
That was good. I've got a question for you too, but I'm gonna save that for a little bit afterwards. Thank you very much, Mr. Page. Heading over to Ms. McNeil, next to you. How would you characterize the media coverage of this election, and was it overall fair and helpful to voters in your view?
Well, I can tell you that I firmly believe that the role of the media in any election campaign is to get people ready to vote. I can only speak for the CBC, and I'll add some observations of what I've noticed of other media as well, but I can tell you from the CBC's perspective that a great deal of thought and care went into not only the information we presented, but how we presented it, and the fact-checking that went into what we put on the air was very deep as well. Number one, we always make sure that in any campaign we give the parties equal time. So that means if, for example, the Liberal leader is doing a rally and I carry it on my show, and there is the Conservative is also carrying the rally, we carry it. We give everybody as much equal time over the course of the campaign as we possibly can. But we also want to make sure that the parties' platforms and how they compare, the comparative platforms under issues, is easily accessible to the audience as well. Without the analysis, just bare bones, so people can look at it and compare it. And so we've done that. Other media have done that as well. And it was a really simple but useful tool for helping people make up their minds. This was not unique to CBC. Other news outlets did it as well. But as I said, it was a great tool for people to use. And we've had some other tools as well. There were new additions this time as well to address the groundswell of targeted disinformation. CBC was part of the Global Trust Project. We joined organizations such as the BBC, Deutsche Press in Germany, the German Press Agency, the Washington Post, New York Times, La Repubblica in Italy. And the purpose of this trust project was to actually help audiences assess whether what they were reading was credible and true. And in doing so, we committed to setting a set of transparency standards, some of which CBC and other major media outlets in Canada already had in place, but there were a few additions as well. So every piece had to have an author byline. You had to have an author background so you could see their credentials. Clear labeling of stories so you could distinguish between analysis and opinion and what was news. Strong corrections policy, publicizing your corrections, making those corrections obvious, citations, references, methodology, and linking to our journalistic standards and practices, rules. But the effort to be accurate and fair went well beyond what we produced. For the first time, we had a disinformation unit, a tactical unit, to tackle false news stories that we found or had been reported to us. Let me add here the definition of disinformation: false information that is deliberately planted to skew the way you feel or think about an issue. Not common gossip online, not mistakes that were made, but deliberately planted there to influence what you're doing. Let me tell you this, it was a very busy unit, and I'll give you an example of two topics that stood out where people were targeting groups to scare them into voting for a particular party or group. Most notable of the topics was immigration. There were claims that Canada was begging African nations for millions of immigrants, trying to take advantage of racial bias of some Canadians. There were claims that when immigrants get here, they receive more benefits than pensioners, which is not true. That immigrants who aren't citizens can vote, which is also untrue. We found false claims about how much support immigrants receive, the number of immigrants coming to Canada, the number of refugees coming to Canada. It went on and on. It was an onslaught on a consistent basis. And then in October, Angus Reid Institute releases a survey on how much Canadians actually knew about immigration in this country. And lo and behold, it turns out most of us were misinformed, grossly misinformed. Most people got it wrong. They thought, for example, they thought that we took in double the amount of refugees that we actually accept. They underestimated the number of economic migrants, for example. They didn't know where the majority of people were coming from. So that was one example of, I think I have time for another, one example of a big disinformation campaign, which, by the way, was coming from inside the country, not outside the country. Another example was the assertion that if the Liberals were elected, they had a plan to legalize hard drugs. And that was uncovered as a targeted campaign targeting Chinese Canadians in particular. Flyers saying candidates support the marijuana killing of our children, that their neighborhoods are under threat from immigration and a Liberal plan to legalize hard drugs. And so the disinformation unit would send that out to all of our reporters, and they would be sure to put that in their reporting on these kinds of topics. The National Observer pointed out that a lot of this material online, these disinformation campaigns, was being tweeted and retweeted at non-human rates. So they believed that bots were being employed in an amplifying campaign. Disinformation campaigns are tools that not only upset elections, but they upset and divide countries and threaten democracies as well. Accurate information, truthful information is the backbone of our democracy. Anything that threatens that must be taken seriously, and active countermeasures must be taken. To answer your question, Aphrodite, I think that much of the media did a good job in this campaign, trying not to be distracted. It's an art and a science. When do you get off the distractions and go back to policy? We tried to stay, I know from our perspective, my program in particular, we were very careful at the beginning to say, let's stay close to the polls. What are those balance issues that Harold talked about earlier? What do people care about the most? And at one point during the campaign, I did notice that people were talking about abortion, guns, immigration, and I thought, whoa, where does that come on the scale in the polls? Very low down. So we self-corrected. We went back to the things that people told us mattered to them: climate change, economics, and healthcare, and tried to stay true to those pieces of information that we felt and knew from the polls that people would be using to make up their mind when it came time to vote. We can talk more about all of this later.
Thank you. Your description of a bot kind of retweeting and at inhuman rates, kind of, I can't imagine that, knowing that and hearing that just must have made your skin crawl as a journalist.
Well, what it does is a challenge. How do you stop that information, knowing that it's reaching so many more people than I can as an individual? So that's why it's really important that companies like and organizations like the CBC have overall policies so that we can amplify the truth, if you will, right? And good correction policies as well. Yeah.
Excellent. We'll talk more in a few minutes. Thank you. Mr. Kingsley, you're up next. Last but not least, how fair was federal election 2019? Do you think that the precautions that we took helped? And do you think that there were any significant vulnerabilities in the way the election was carried out?
Well, thank you. I appreciate this opportunity very much. Kevin was talking about the fact that the rest of the world is starting to look at Canada in terms of how we do things on the financial front. Well, they've been looking at Canada for 30 years on democratic issues, especially elections, because Canada is recognized as an outstanding democracy. So the question for me is easy to answer this evening. Of course, our election was fair. We've seen some of the shortcomings, they were explained, but fundamentally, and I intend to explain the reasons that I feel this way, we've achieved, once again, a good election in Canada. The people spoke, 2/3 of us, obviously not all of us, but 2/3 of us spoken, in what is a free and fair environment. And when I say free and fair, I'm not talking about, when I do an international comparison, I'm not talking about the new or emerging democracies. I'm talking about the established democracies when I make that comment. I'm talking about the UK, I'm talking about France, I'm talking about Switzerland, I'm talking about the Scandinavian countries, all countries that I've visited. And we're number one. Why? Well, first of all, we have an independent chief electoral officer responsible to Parliament, has nothing to do with government. She has, the chief electoral officer, the statutory authority to spend money. That is to say, Parliament has not voted for it. If the chief electoral officer needs to spend money to achieve the purpose of the statute, it goes forward. The priority is the elector. We have redistribution in this country where the seats are allocated not based on gerrymandering, but the judge chairs every commission in every province. A judge chairs that. We have a controlled dollar. We control the money that goes into our elections. There's a slight issue that arose at this election, I'll talk about that later, but we essentially control money like nobody else controls the money flow into elections around the world. We also have enforcement, and I think it's so important for people to understand the only people who can recognize that someone is guilty of an offense under the Canada Elections Act is a judge in Canada, unless you're willing to admit that you committed something that was illegal and the commissioner decides to handle that with other tools. Nobody else declares a Canadian to have broken the Canada Elections Act. And lastly, we have all of us the right to vote. There are no exceptions except for the age limit. With one slight exception, the chief electoral officer does not vote in Canada. He's the only one who does not vote, who's 18 or above on polling day. All of us, there is no limitation. All Canadians who live abroad, 34,000 of them voted in this election. All Canadians. There is no limit in terms of whether or not you have the mental capacity to do that. You self-determine that, and Canadians do that. Now, were there precautions? Well, I was surprised to hear all the things that were happening with bots and all those terms that I barely understand. But the precautions there were two main ones. One of them was the Deputy Minister Committee, and I thought that their task was really to look at, is there a foreign invasion of our election, either through a government or a government-sponsored agency outside of Canada. I don't know if they found anything. If they did not tell us. I can only assume that they would have told us. This is what part of their mandate. If they found anything major, I can only assume that what you found, which was significant, was not through that source. The other precaution that was taken was the Chief Electoral Officer set up a unit to find out if anybody was misinforming Canadians about electoral activities. And we've seen that. We saw robocalls in previous elections. And there were a smattering of some robocalls through, I think, was a third party, but I'm not sure, about polling day itself. The way that it looked to me, I don't think that there was much to do about that, but the commissioner, will be looking at that, into that, presumably. Now, the vulnerabilities to the present system, and I think we have to consider the vulnerabilities because, as Leonard Cohen told us, everything has a crack in it, and that's how the light comes in. But we have the vulnerabilities of the social media, Facebook and all the other ones. We have yet to come to grips with how do we handle the lies that these media perpetuate. How do we handle the hate that these people, the racism, how do we handle this? We've let these corporations just come along and do what they want. I thought that we created them to serve us. I didn't think that we were created to serve them or to do their bidding. How can the president of such a firm refuse to be interviewed by a Parliament of Canada committee? I don't get that. We also had, I was mentioning that there was some money that came into the system and it became an issue. It was the Manning Centre that provided a third party with funding. The third party reported that the Manning Centre had provided the funding. But the Manning Centre, I think it was around $600,000 that were donated, did not want to reveal, refused to reveal how they got the $600,000. So was it foreign money? Is there something, why do you not want to reveal it? We allow corporations, unions, associations to participate in our elections as third parties. We allow them to pick up monies from others. We just regulate it like it should be regulated. But still, you know, someone, and this is where that expression about the crack is contradictory. What I found is if you allow a crack in the money in politics, it takes no time for a Brinks truck to be driven right through it. And they know how to do it, I'll tell you. So with respect to the DM's committee, one thought that I've had, which I've shared previously, there should be a person there who is independent. And I will leave my thoughts there because I have 9 seconds left and I want to beat all the others. So thank you very much.
I think it's interesting, all of you brought up so many very, very important points, and I think it can be overwhelming as an ordinary Canadian, just considering all of these different issues. Each one is very important and can affect so many parts of our democracy. I want to start though, Ms. Curran, you made an interesting point. You said that there were a lot of shallow vote buying efforts, that brief, shallow talking points kind of really was the theme of the election. But when has that not been the theme of any election? Do you remember a time when it was really not like that? Because
I do. I mean, I worked for former Prime Minister Harper, and we never ran an election on how much money can we give individual voters. It was always a broader plan for securing economic prosperity and securing Canada's place in the world.
I think every party would probably turn around and tell you that exactly what they intend to.
Well, yeah, but it was not this look like how many tax credits. And there was absolutely some of that in there in conservative platforms, and some of that sort of what's in there for me, and we always throw a bit of that in there. But the broader theme and the broader perspective was not that. Mm-hmm. It was a bigger vision for the country. And I think we have had that in the past. I think this election is unique. It's the first time that I can remember that we really haven't talked about a bigger vision for Canada. Whether or not you can sort of decipher it among, you know, the tea leaves of various party platforms is a good question, but it's the first time I've seen no party make any effort whatsoever to touch those underlying issues.
Mm-hmm. You also mentioned something super interesting about just this lack of a debate on the way we will progress on resource development, oil and gas. Does nuclear have a space in that debate too?
It sure does. So we're talking about what are the answers to emissions reduction. If we are in the business of getting out of oil and gas development or trying to reduce our emissions while transitioning out of that sector or maintaining some presence there, nuclear has to be a part of that discussion. And we haven't, again, even touched that.
That's
Absolutely. And the new generation nuclear technology is probably our best answer right now to reducing emissions. The Green Party is opposed to that. The NDP doesn't seem to want to talk about it. And the other parties aren't touching it either. So there are new technologies, there are new answers out there to some of these problems, and we're just not exploring them. We're staying in the same box. Frankly, the policy discussion that we had in 2019 was largely a version of the policy discussion we had in 2015 and in 2011. Like, we haven't progressed much at all.
Why? Does anybody want to jump in? Why do you think we haven't progressed at all? Was it the format of some of the conversations? You know, we were discussing about how those debates went. A lot of people were upset about how those debates went, and I suspect it's because people expected more from our politicians to go deeper, and it just didn't happen. Yeah. Some people would say. So if you were to change that, how would you change that? What would be the ideal format of a debate to allow for this?
Well, the ideal format for a debate, I'm not sure there is an ideal format, but you could take the English debate from this election and think about things that you might do to pull it more in the direction that Rachel was suggesting. Often it's suggested there should be a debate of some kind between the leaders of the two largest parties. And Mr. Scheer, of course, would have liked that very much, but he's never going to get that, you know, in the way our debates are structured in Canada now, either because there's no provision for structuring it that way anymore, or because the Prime Minister won't agree to it. Even if you proposed it, the Prime Minister probably would not agree to that, not in his interest to do so. You probably would want to debate, the French debate, which followed the English debate, was much better because the single moderator did try to keep it back on track a little bit more. But the problem with the French debate was that all of the leaders realized that they just want to talk to Quebec voters. And that's what the French debates have become. When we first had this idea about how to use debates in Canadian elections, everybody agreed should be one in French, one in English, because the country is bilingual. It makes perfect sense. But it hasn't really evolved that way because the French debate now in most elections, and especially in this one, has become a separate event. And if you have someone like Mr. Blanchet in that, he is speaking to a very specific segment of the electorate, emphasizing Quebec issues, lots of discussion about Bill 21, discussion of equalization payments and so on. These are not the national issues or priorities that would be discussed in a debate that was more one-on-one. So we had the French debate being targeted to a different audience, the English debate being chopped up into little segments, where it's very, very difficult to have a sustained discussion of any issue, no matter how you put it on the table. I thought, speaking with the CBC, I thought that the face-to-face segments that they did, which were entirely new and quite separate from the bigger debates, were really quite good. And that was an innovation that I think could be followed more or maybe built on if we wanted to try to get away from what the debates seem to have become in our elections. Because even though they weren't a debate between the leaders, it did put a single leader on the spot for a half an hour, being asked some of the questions that you would ask, and then the moderator could follow it up. And they would say, well, Mr. Scheer, when you say X, what about this? And you get a little more sustained discussion. I'm not sure if you could do that in a format where the leaders are going at each other, but they could certainly do a bit of it in the face-to-face segments.
There are good reasons, of course, why leaders in debate contexts or others don't want to talk about benefits and costs, because that divides electorates.
Yes.
And invites people to say, gee, I might be one of those who are bearing the costs. It's much better to stay on what I call the valence track, that I'm going to, you know, very famously, not in a debate context, but in a scrum with reporters, when asked about what he was going to do about inflation, Pierre Trudeau said, "I will wrestle inflation to the ground." And he's playing there. What he's doing, unlike Robert Stanfield, who said, "Oh well, we'll have wage and price controls." Trudeau is playing on this valence image he has. Hey, I'm a competent guy. I'm an athlete. I'm this. You know, I can do it, guys. Come with me, and everybody's going to be benefiting. And so this idea of an alternative, you know, or not an alternative, but it's something else other than the debates, where you can really press individual leaders on policy, is one that may well be a way forward. Because certainly in the debates, leaders are going to run away from things, and rightly so, in terms of maximizing their potential vote share of anything that might divide people along cost and benefit lines. They don't want to, you know, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to pay more taxes, or I'm going to do the people, you know, politicians may not be Einstein, but they're surely smart enough to figure that out. They don't want to do that with the electorate.
Or talk about trade-offs. Because
yeah, they don't want to do trade-offs. You don't want to do trade-offs. You want to invite people to trust me. And with some issues, like health care, for example, there's only 2 words any politicians will use on third-rail issues like that: more money. More money. Those are the only things they're going to say. And people, well, where's that going to come from? Well, I think we need, like you say, another format may well allow an investigation of that.
Interestingly, when we talk about the way the debate kind of really highlighted the way things were very disparate in the nation. You mentioned the French debate, but I wonder if Ms. McNeil, in your experience,
Call me Carol.
Carol, in your experience, did you notice the Western alienation at all, or anything like any regionality developing?
That had been brewing for a while. That goes beyond, I think, beyond the election campaign, but it was amplified during the election campaign for sure. And one of the things that I'm concerned about now as a journalist is how much of that anger that we're seeing from Saskatchewan and Alberta. I mean, certainly we saw it in the numbers of MPs that were Liberal MPs that were elected, so there's a great deal of anger that we can point to those that were none. So we can point to that and say there is a great deal of anger, or at least a non-engagement with Ottawa on the part of Saskatchewan and Alberta. But at the same time, we're starting to see this anger between East and West in Ontario, and jealousy. And I don't know how much of that is real and how much of it is amplified through disinformation campaigns or people who are trying to inflate this situation to make it seem worse than it really is. So what I think the role of media in this case is, and in particular a corporation like the CBC, where we have the capacity to create empathy, at the very least, and understanding between parts of our great nation, we can start a dialogue between people in Ontario and people in Alberta and people in Newfoundland and people in Saskatchewan, and really talk about the things we have in common and the things that divide us, and gain some empathy for each other's position. And I think it's going to be more important. Our role in this will be more important than ever going forward.
I think that's a brilliant point. But if I'm just going to look at what people were saying, if you think about what Dr. Leduc was saying about the French debate, that turned into a very kind of obvious effort at connecting with the Quebec voter. But that just didn't happen anywhere else. So as an outsider looking at that and just analyzing how that may have played out for others in the rest of the country, like, oh, well, they have their own debate, and what about us? Is that something that can just create further issues?
Well, it's a reflection of Quebec's unique status in our country. And of course, people in Quebec care about the same things that everyone else in Canada cares about, but they have unique cares and concerns as well.
Of course, as people in the West might say.
Yeah, look, I think Carol's idea is absolutely fantastic. I would love to see the CBC do a profile of one of the tens of thousands of people in Alberta who have lost their jobs, who have lost their houses, who have gone bankrupt, who have had to move to another part of the country to get a job. I don't think we're a huge country.
And explore the reasons for that.
Yeah, exactly. We're geographically a huge country. We are regionally very divided, more divided now than we have ever been. I think there's a real role for media, as Carol says, to start telling those stories in various regions so that we gain an understanding of what's going on. Calgary is not a fun place right now. Half the office buildings in the city are empty. People are out of work, they're desperate, they're doing desperate things, drug addiction is up, suicide rates are up. And here in Ontario and Quebec, we don't really hear a lot about that. So I think there is a real role for the CBC in particular as our national broadcaster to tell those stories.
Can we criticize the media for a minute or two?
I'm a professor now.
A lot of this discussion of divisiveness in the country and how divided we are and how polarized we are has been since the election, not during the election campaign. And I think it began to really bubble right to the surface like this when the media, not just the CBC, but media writ large, started putting up that multicolored map. You know, blue on one side, red on the other side, splotches of yellow in the middle, and talking about, oh, well, look how divided we are. And that's a post-election debate. That's an interpretation of the election. Now, Jean-Pierre, you might confirm that this is partly the electoral system we're looking at. A third of Albertans, 1/3 of Albertans voted for the Liberals or the NDP. No one is even noticing that or even recognizing that fact. It's as if it's Alberta against the rest of the country. In Quebec, the Bloc and the Liberals got about the same number of seats. You know, that big blue, light blue splotch on the map makes it look very different because the Liberal seats are here in Montreal, you know, and not in the parts that you see on the map. So I do think that's quite artificial, and I think the media, by framing it that way, does us a disservice.
But that's why it's important, if I may, that's why it's important that we tell each other our stories, you know, and not characterize, not go out and find just the oil worker who has lost their job, not just the person who believes in climate change at all costs in Ontario, but people who believe, you know, we're multifaceted individuals in this country. We can hold two opposing thoughts at the same time. And to really explain to each other who we are and what our experience is in this country without creating, like I say, a caricature of a two-dimensional individual. Yeah.
Mr. Kingsley.
Jean-Pierre.
Jean-Pierre.
With respect,
Okay,
we agreed before you're breaking the covenant here. Number one, I wanted to mention one thing about the debates, okay? I was listening to Larry and I'm saying, why are the leaders telling us how they want the debates to be done? Why aren't we telling the leaders? The interest of the elector has to come first, and we should be deciding how that should run. There was a commission that was set up, independent. They came out with a basic model. Only 2 debates is what they required. And the leaders still can veto. I did not think that they could, but perhaps they can. Let's turn this around. You're the head of a party. You have to go to the debate. That's where issues are going to be debated. End of story. You don't go.
Rachel's like, I don't know if that's going to work.
Well, Prime Minister Trudeau didn't agree to more than 2, I think.
That's right.
Or,
yeah.
well, 3 with the extra French debate this
Well, with a minority government, we might be able to get our way. Okay, and that brings me to proportional representation, which you wanted me to
Yes.
very briefly.
Yes.
The Liberal caucus will not have anybody from Saskatchewan or Alberta. There will be nobody in cabinet from these provinces. If it were a proportional system, now we cannot go on the basis of the numbers of voters, how they cast their ballots. It would have been different if it had been a proportional system. We don't know how different because we haven't got it. But it would have been different.
Or even more proportional than the present
Yes.
system. We have the least proportional system we could possibly design.
So, and you know, one of the reasons why the idea was turfed out initially was because we didn't want to see this happen. Well, it's happening under the system we've got now. But luckily, we might get a taste of what a minority government can do or cannot do, depending upon how they do things, okay, if they're really intent on governing in accordance with the will of the people. And interestingly enough, I think that the debate will come back, despite what I heard on the CBC the night of the election, where everyone was saying proportional representation is out proportional. Mr. Singh today started the ball rolling. I can only assume that the Green Party, with 1,100,000 votes and 3 seats, will probably chip in again, and I know her very well, and I know she will. And you know, the Bloc is going to be caught, because there's a report in the province of Quebec for proportional representation. A bill will be tabled by the present government, and the Parti Québécois, with whom the Bloc Québécois is related, has signed on to proportional representation for Quebec. So I think that the climate it's going to be debated again. It's going to come back as a topic. I'm looking forward to that debate.
Absolutely.
I'm quoting Pierre Trudeau again tonight. Many years ago, you know, the map we're talking about looks a lot like it did in the earlier periods in Canadian history, and some of them not so long ago. Years ago, when Trudeau was, the elder was asked about the problem of representation of the West in a Liberal government, he says, well, you guys, he's talking to us, I think he may have actually been in Alberta at the time, I'm not sure, but he said, hey, you want representation? Vote for Liberals. And that's exactly what he said, and of course, it did not go down well in the West. But
you also said, why should I sell your wheat?
That's right. So he said, this kind of
Things have changed. Really.
Yes.
Well, I wonder if they really have. That's what I'm saying. I wonder if they really have. I guess we'll find out. Jean-Pierre is saying there may be some chance for structural reform, which would change the situation. I've been disappointed on that a number of times. I'm not willing to bet on it again. But no, very, to me, it's a very typical sort of Canadian result in many ways. A balance of Liberals and a BQ in Quebec, a solid West for the Tories, big, strong Liberal support in, the one, 79 seats in Ontario this time, and very strong in the Maritime. It looks like Canada to me politically.
Strong in urban areas too.
Yeah, of course. It really looks like Canada in a lot of the history that I know.
Would you say the same thing, Mr. Page?
Yeah, I think we need to be open-minded about how divided we are. I'm not convinced we're as, obviously we see our political leaders, and it's disappointing to see them to create this sort of division. But I think when Harold showed his chart early on, he said, there's things that Canadians really care about, election after election after election. They care about the economy, they care about healthcare, they care about education, and now we care more and more about the environment. Those are fundamental things, and it's true. Like in provinces like Alberta, where I have friends, I grew up in Thunder Bay, my friends, my cousins, nephews would travel to Fort McMurray to make money because there was no money to be made in Thunder Bay. And so they would travel, and so the price of oil has collapsed and will likely stay at these levels for a long time. And we need a strategy for Alberta to grow Alberta, because Albertans, they worry about their economy. And when their economy is weak, they worry about their health care, and they worry about education in their future. So, to me, I don't know that this is there's parts of the country that don't like Albertans, or Albertans don't like Liberals, or whatever this is. I just think we need to solve the problem, and the problem is economic. We need a good economic strategy for Alberta, and I think we avoided the hard debates that Rachel talked about. I think affordability was just the lowest common denominator. Housing is a problem in Vancouver and Toronto, but actually our inflation rate has been running at 2%. Most of the world is worried about deflation. The price is actually declining. But what we do see when you look deeper in the numbers is that, not everybody's benefiting by this economy. And not just Alberta, but there are a lot of Canadians. You look at how income is shifting in the economy. There's been growth in this economy. It may not be 2 or 3% growth, but it's still been a lot of growth. Unemployment rate below 6%. But when you look at income, it's all going to the top 1%. Top 10%. So there's a lot of people even in this room and in provinces across the country that are not experiencing that same sense of security. To me, I think we need a different type of leadership that kind of is about uniting. We definitely need Alberta strategy. We need to recognize it for what it is. Actually, fossil fuels isn't the future. We could still manage, we could still have another pipeline, but it's not the future. A lot of us have grown up, my dad was in the pulp and paper industry. My friends went into I was in the pulp and paper industry. That's not the future. Like when we're competing. So it's going to change, and we need a strategy for Alberta, and we can do that.
Two quick questions. A, what is the future when it comes to energy? Out of curiosity.
Yeah, it's green.
There's no good answer to that.
I know, I'm just wondering.
It is.
That's the problem.
No, there is a good answer. We could change these systems, and the transformations are happening all over the world. It will happen in Canada. We're blessed by having these energy resources, so it's kind of hard to turn them, but it's not the long-term future. We can't keep producing, putting these greenhouse gases in the environment. We can see all the changes. Like, again, I think we're going to have to put a price on carbon. It's going to have to be significant. It's going to have to go way up. There's ways to distribute those gains when we put those prices on carbon, but that is our future. Again, I think we need politicians that could give us this information right between the eyes and be honest and develop strategies for Alberta and Saskatchewan and Newfoundland and Labrador, because we need to bring them along.
In your talk, you mentioned that there was a point where the books could have been balanced in 2018 and 2019. Do you think that was a missed opportunity?
No. No, I think, again, I was at the Department of Finance right through the 80s, and we were a mess. We were running deficits. They were, relative to the size of the economy, like 4 or 5 percentage points. They were so big, those deficits, they're like what Donald Trump is running in the United States right now. Our deficit is less than 1%. And actually, the carrying cost on this debt, like when the Department of Finance, when our debt, like for every revenue dollar we were taking in, we were spending about 38 cents on public interest in the mid-1990s. Now we're spending 7 cents. And I remember my bosses would be going to brief various conservative and liberal ministers. They say they had no fiscal room because our credit card had blown up. We're adding to the stock of debt, but we've never seen these interest rates so low. So we're having these debates. We need to have lower and lower interest rates. Well, we need fiscal policy to correct some of these problems too. If there's a recession coming, it's not going to be monetary policy that's going to help Canadians. It will be fiscal policy. We will need to put more money into infrastructure. There'll be more support for programs like employment insurance. So I don't think, and I'm a fiscal person. No, I don't think we should worry about running deficits that are as small as the ones we're running in Canada right now. Yeah, we need, and are we fiscally sustainable? Like when we do these aging demographic projections, federally we're fiscally sustainable. Quebec is fiscally sustainable. Provinces like Ontario and a few others, they have to deal with, in some Atlantic Canada provinces, they have to deal with their issues. But even then, the size of that fiscal instability problem is not enormous. Like our big problem isn't balancing the books. It's dealing with some of these broader internal issues that are in these debates that Rachel wanted us to address, which includes income distribution.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So the little clock isn't working, so I'm not sure how much time we have left. Sorry? It's over. Okay, it's over. Wait, I want to go around and just take not bets, but projections. How long do you think before the next election? Just out of curiosity, dinner party talk.
Yeah, I think it's going to be quite a while.
I do too.
First of all, just the simple arithmetic tells you that the strong Liberal minority government, as Harold characterized it, is not in any danger of falling anytime soon. All it needs are some of the NDP votes, and that adds up to a majority of both the parliamentary seats and the total vote. So the idea, even though there are more parties, those parties would all have to get together to defeat the government. There's no likelihood.
So you think some strong stability, in fact?
So I would think, and both of Harper's minority governments lasted quite a long time. I think one was the longest ever, and the other one was the second longest ever. Yeah.
So the other point is, of course, is that Mr. Scheer may not be around that long. And the process of the politics of that are going to take a while. And so I agree with Larry that it may be, this is in the world of minority governments, this is one that's liable to last longer than the average.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'll weigh in so you can go to the other side. So I think it'll be at least 2 years. There's no incentive for any of the parties to pull the plug. The NDP are in the best position they've been in for a long time. The Liberals now, and Mr. Page, you alluded to this too, I'm worried about the spending levels now with this minority government. They can run up the deficit now and say, well, the NDP are making us do this, and so things are going to get a little looser. I agree we don't have a big worry at the federal level now, but I do think the federal government is going to have to bail out the provinces at some point soon. Our healthcare system is not sustainable, so the federal government needs to maintain room to do that. So I don't think, given that, it's in the interest of the Liberals and the NDP to keep this running for as long as they can. They're not going to want to go back to the polls anytime soon, so I think we're in for at least 2 years.
Okay, so 2 years, 2 years, 2 years?
Yeah, 2 years. But I hope we can get at some of the issues that Jean-Pierre was talking about, like proportional representation. I hope we can use minority parliaments to actually encourage, institutional change. Thank you. I got a fan over there.
Love it. Jean-Pierre?
One of the issues that was raised is whether or not one of the parties, the NDP, had enough money to even think about an election. Everyone was talking about they've mortgaged their building. And you can't mortgage a mortgage. I mean, it's done. But one of the things that was done in Canada is that initially when we put limits, significant limits on contributions by individuals, all the parties agreed to a per vote subsidy. It was $2. This was under Chrétien, Mr. Chrétien, and this was taken away. And this has impoverished the parties that don't have the same claim to the same people who contribute. I mean, if you're the NDP, you're not appealing to the people with a lot of money, as other parties may be. So we've impoverished the NDP. We also tried to scuttle the bloc by doing that, but they were successful in overcoming that. That was part of the deal between the parties. That was done away with. I think we ought to consider bringing it back. Maybe not at $2 a vote, maybe $1.50, maybe $1. But we need to get this back into the system because this is what was the deal initially on the money.
Absolutely. Closing thoughts, Carol? I won't force you to.
What was that?
Any closing thoughts on?
No, I was just doing the calculations on that. I think, obviously there's the issue, we've mentioned healthcare a few times. I think it is the festering issue. I think that's going to be a huge issue going forward in this country. There are a lot of places in this country that are suffering, that don't have adequate healthcare services, and that needs to be addressed if we're going to call ourselves universal, and if we're going to address ourselves to those issues that really is having an impact on people. It's climate change, healthcare, and going forward, affordability. It's exactly what the poll said. Those are going to be the defining issues going ahead as far as I can tell.
Thank you. And thank you to all of our panelists for taking part in this event. Just a few more words to our Associate Dean for your opening remarks and continued support of the WSSR program by the Faculty of Arts and Science here at Concordia, to our audience and to our dedicated WSSR students and participants, to the D.B. Clark Theater and staff, to the IITS, and to CPAC, the cable public affairs channel, who work tirelessly to bring important content like this to Canadians coast to coast. Thank you for joining us.